I wrote about an Everly Brothers record called EB84 that was made in 1984. But I think to set that up, it's important to know how the Everly Brothers broke up once and for all, which is a really sad story. I mean, first of all, Phil and Don never really got along from the time they were teenagers, never really agreed on anything. So there was a lot of bickering going on, a lot of falling out. In 1973, they were playing at Knott's Berry Farm in Los Angeles. And it was kind of a low point in the Everly Brothers' career. I mean, they hadn't had a hit in a while. And it was one of those deals where it was, you know, they were doing 3 shows in a day. And Don was drinking. And by the second show, it was noticeably, he was drunk. He was forgetting words and not hitting the notes. And things got so bad that the promoter came out on stage and said, you know, we need to cut this short, you know. And Phil got so mad that he smashed his guitar on stage and just like stormed off. And that was the end of the Everly Brothers. That was the way they broke up. I mean, all this beautiful harmony and music through the 50s and 60s comes to an end like on this little, you know, theme park stage in 1973. The brothers only spoke once from 1973 to 1983 at their dad's funeral. Didn't see each other, didn't speak. So the prospect of them ever getting back together didn't look good. Yet in 1983, a promoter in England offered them a lot of money to reunite at the Albert Hall for 2 nights, which they did. Very famously. I mean, those shows were made into a VHS release and a double album. It was a really big deal. And for this piece that I wrote, I interviewed 2 of the guys who were not only in the band that night at the Albert Hall, but went on to play with the Everly Brothers through the 80s. And that was a keyboard player named Pete Wingfield and a drummer named Terry Williams. Terry famously played in Rockpile with Dave Edmunds and Nick Lowe. So both of them, just delightful guys, you know, very English and very quirky. I've played with everybody, you know. Said that was truly a magic night, not only on stage, because here's Phil and Don, they haven't sung together for 10 years, and it's still that magic blend. Like as soon as they start to sing, it's like, there they are. Nobody can sound like that. And Terry told me, it's like they would, you know, they were looking out in the audience and it was, you know, there was Pete Townsend and, you know, there was Mick Jagger's, like it was a star-studded George Harrison. Everybody was there who'd grown up on the Everlys. And the shows were so successful that it seemed only natural that they should make an album, you know, and capitalize on it. So they asked Dave Edmunds to be the producer. I guess they were aware not only of Rockpile, but Dave Edmunds and Nick Lowe had famously made an EP called The Beverly Brothers. Do you know about this? So it's really great. Dave and Nick covered 5 Everly Brothers songs. Poor Jenny, Problems, just, you know, some kind of obscure things aside from Bye Bye Love. And I think the Everly Brothers were aware of them and thought Dave would be a good match. You know, the challenge for Dave Edmunds was, it's 1984. You think about what's going on in music then. It's the Eurythmics and Culture Club. It's like a very different scene. So on one hand, do we try to make the Everly Brothers fit in with the times, or do we just honor what they do? So Dave chose the latter approach. Like, let's make a record like Chet Atkins made in the late 50s, where it's a band playing live and the Everlys at the same mic. We'll just capture the old magic. So yeah, he had some cachet as a producer, aside from being a solo artist. So his first stop was to knowing that the Everly Brothers, you know, Don writes, but they weren't going to have any songs, that he'd have to collect songs. So he called Paul McCartney and Jeff Lynne and Mark Knopfler, said, like, can you write something for the Everly Brothers? And then Dave came to Nashville and listened to a bunch of songs by Music Row guys, you know, assembled all these songs, brought the Everlys over to England, and meanwhile got this band together. So Pete Wingfield on keyboards, Albert Lee on guitar, Terry Williams on drums. It's just this, incredible kind of English A-team studio band. And in his mind, Dave's thinking this is going to be just like the old days, like we're gonna have Phil and Don, like they're getting along now at the mic together. And it was apparent within 2 or 3 days that whatever motivated Phil and Don to make a new record, it wasn't that they had this sort of great love for each other again. They still were not getting along. So they would show up at the studio at different times, and they would never get on the mic together. And that was Dave's hope. And Pete Wingfield was the musical director, and he was saying, we were all thinking we were going to be playing and like they were going to be at the mic in the vocal booth together. And he said it never worked that way, because they would be in the studio and Phil would say, Don, why don't you do your vocal and I'll just put on the harmony later. Like they would do anything to avoid singing on the same mic. They only did it on one song on that record, and that was the song that Paul McCartney wrote called On the Wings of a Nightingale that became a big hit. So interesting talking to Pete Wingfield and Terry Williams. I was like, so what was it like being around Phil and Don every day? And Pete said, it's a very binary world in the Everlys. They're completely different in every way. Phil was conservative politically. Don was, a lefty. Don was really tense and kind of suspicious and paranoid. Phil was really sweet and open-hearted. And the thing was, you had to choose sides. You had to be a Phil guy or a Don guy. And once you chose sides, the other guy didn't talk to you. So that's a pretty awkward position for a studio musician to be in. Like you're making a record with two brothers. And of course they all kind of chose Phil because he was the nicest, And then Don ended up kind of cutting them off and wouldn't even speak to them in the studio. So there's all this tension behind the scenes on this album. They wouldn't sing together. They weren't talking to each other. They would find any reason to go, like, I'm going to go out and have a long lunch with this friend. Any reason not to be in the studio at the same time. And yet, when you listen to EB84, it's quite beautiful. I mean, however Dave Edmunds went about capturing those vocals, if they were separate, most of them, they still sound amazing. Because Phil and Don, they could still sing. Their ranges were beautiful, and the songs are really good, But it's interesting to hear what's going on behind the scenes. And then Pete and Terry went on tour with them, and all of that Phil guy, Don guy continued. They said there were 2 buses, like everybody was on the Phil bus. It's really sad. I mean, you think there's a lot of history in rock and pop music of siblings not getting along, whether it's Ray and Dave Davies or the Gallagher brothers, especially in Creedence Clearwater with the Fogertys. And you always think, well, maybe as they get older, they'll be more mature and they'll make up. But apparently, Phil and Don never made up, Right up until the time Phil passed before Don did, they weren't speaking. They just never had anything to do with each other. And they were on the road through the 80s. After EB84, they made 2 more albums in the 80s. They toured a lot, toured all the way into the early 2000s, And Pete was on every one of those tours, and he said it was always the same. They wouldn't speak to each other. They'd get on stage, they'd sing beautifully for an hour and 15 minutes, and then go their separate ways.
They set the bar for what 2 people singing together could be.
I think so. There's never been anybody better. It's that shared DNA thing too. I mean, just the same way that the Bee Gees, the brothers Gibb. I think when you have that shared DNA, there's something extra that happens. 2 voices become one a third voice, you know.
Cow Sills.
Cow Sills, yeah. Beach Boys, of course, you know. But anyway, it just makes me sad to think that they didn't get along, you know. Although I guess I kind of knew it, but to hear these musicians who were around them every day talk about the discomfort, especially with Don, like he was just not, for somebody who sings so beautifully, to be such an unpleasant person. You know, I guess I won't say I'm disillusioned by it, because I've been in the music business long enough to know personal dynamics are not always easy, but you want them, you know, when you listen to the Everly Brothers, you want them to like be close and friends, you know.
I want to put this tag on the end of this, though, that our buddy Barry Mazer is writing a biography of the Everly Brothers, and
Wow,
there's never been one made.
That's a big challenge.
You know, Barry's great, and I think it's going to be great, but I just want people to know that that's somewhere on the horizon and to watch out for it.
I know Barry's been a journalist for a long time. My first thought when I hear that, there's never even been a good magazine article on the Everly Brothers, really. I mean, the one that I wrote was very much about a moment, because without access to Phil and Don, which of course now is impossible, I don't know how you would tell that story. Yeah, I loved his book on Ralph Peer. I know he's a good writer, and I'm glad somebody is finally doing it. Don Everly was the first famous person I saw in Nashville. It was my first month here, and there was somewhere on 21st, there was a coffee shop then, not Fido, something else, and I was in line, and he was behind me, and I couldn't believe, I mean, I was a huge Everly Brothers fan, and I was like, I didn't say anything, I just couldn't believe it, you know. I never got to interview him, never got to interview Phil. I know Don's daughter pretty well, Venetia, she lives here. And then, I think when Paul Simon played the Bridgestone in 2019, for the encore, Don came out and they did Bye Bye Love together, and that was pretty magic. You know, I mean, Don, you know, his voice wasn't what it was, but it was still, you could still recognize it as Don Everly, you know.
That had to be a big moment for Paul.
Yeah, I would say so. Although the Everly Brothers did open for Simon and Garfunkel in the 80s, a couple of gigs. So I think the debt was acknowledged many times, you know. It's a shame they didn't get to work together. It would have been interesting to hear Paul write songs for the Everlys, you know.
Oh, yeah. The idea of Paul McCartney writing Everly Brothers songs just kind of gave me a little joke.
That's a great song, too. And you know, that makes sense, too, because, of course, Paul and John loved the Everly Brothers. You know, a lot of their early harmonies are kind of based on the Everlys. I knew Please Please Me before Kathy's Clown. And there's that thing that happens where you hold one note and the harmony note drops down and it gets that half-step rub. I always thought, I wonder if the Everly Brothers were copying the Beatles at that point. Although, I don't know. I think timeline-wise, Kathy's Clown might have been before Please Please Me. Well, I think they had a hard time in the 60s when things started changing. You know, they tried to dabble in, you know, things that sounded like British Invasion and psychedelic, but it never really quite fit them as well as that early stuff. Yeah, and after that breakup, Don did an interview with Rolling Stone where he was pretty contrite and said, you know, I've never been drunk on stage before. It was just, we had just reached a low point. And the way he put it, just like what you're saying, he said, my brother and I had been strapped together like horses for 15 years. We never had a break from each other, and it was just too much, you know?
And the average person does not realize what the travel and the constant being around people, you're under stress and you're constantly tired. You're probably taking medication to make you a little more alert every day and wake up. And
probably.
It's just hard to be around the same people all the time, and everything gets amplified.
Yeah, and think about the diminishing returns of, you know, in the late 50s, the Everly Brothers were on all the TV shows and they were selling out venues. And then through the 60s, and here you are in the early 70s and you're playing a theme park. you know, and they want you to do 3 shows, and they probably say like you got to do all your hits in 40 minutes. And I always think about bands like, I don't know why Cheap Trick comes to mind. I love Cheap Trick, and they've been doing it so long, but you know, they've never really recaptured their 70s and 80s heyday. So probably when they pull into Nashville, they remember when they sold out the Municipal Auditorium, you know, around the time of whatever, Heaven Tonight. And here they are coming back and they're playing, you know, the Cannery or something, you know. It's just the, you know, everybody who's in the music business understands that's just kind of the arc of a career. And you stay in it because you love it and you don't know how to do anything else. And
if you're lucky, you end up
yeah,
playing the Cannery all those years later.
Right. Yes.
A lot of people just end up hearing their old songs on the radio while they're working a day job.
Yeah, no kidding. Or worse.
Or worse.
Yeah. I kind of feel like maybe they got spoiled in a way by their early success. And then when they couldn't repeat it, whatever personal problems they had were probably compounded by that, you know. Anyway, I'm excited to hear that Barry's writing a book. If I ever run into him, I'll just congratulate him for taking that on. That's a big project.